When Clara, among other captive war prisoners, arrived Iron Fang Citadel, nobody thought of anything special about her. But what she became after the Alpha King claimed her, even as a blind prisoner, left the kingdom in total shock. Find out what happened in this werewolf romance story.
The castle slept, or believed to be sleeping. Torches flickered along the stone corridors, their light dancing across cold walls that had seen too much war. Outside the fortress, the forest was quiet. No wolves howled tonight. Peace had finally returned to the kingdom, but not to its king. Alpha King Roknar stood beside the tall window of his chamber, staring into the darkness beyond the valley. 3 weeks. 3 weeks since the war ended. 3 weeks since the battlefield fell silent. 3 weeks since he buried his queen. His fingers tightened slowly against the stone window frame. Sleep had abandoned him. Not once in 21 nights had it stayed longer than a few restless minutes, because whenever he closed his eyes, the war returned. Steel clashing, men shouting, blood soaking the ground. And the moment she fell, Roknar stepped away from the window. The chamber felt suffocating tonight, too quiet, too empty. He began pacing. Across the chamber, back again, boots striking the stone floor, over and over. The guards outside his doors had learned something during these nights. When the king walked like this, it meant sleep would not come, and when sleep did come, it brought screams. Roknar stopped beside a small wooden table. A goblet of wine rested there, untouched. He stared at it for a moment, then pushed it aside. Wine would not quiet his mind. Nothing did. Not the healers, not the priests, not the victory his people celebrated. The war had taken something from him, something no crown could restore. His eyes drifted across the chamber. Her cloak still hung against the far wall, dark blue, silver thread along the edges. She had worn it the morning she rode to battle beside him. He remembered her laughter. "I'm a Luna," she had said, "not someone who hides behind castle walls." For a moment, the memory warmed him. Then the next memory came, the arrow, the blood, the silence after. Roknar turned away, his chest tightened. Sleep would not come tonight. It never did. Then, suddenly, a horn sounded in the distance. Low, long. The sound rolled across the fortress like thunder. Roknar looked toward the window again. Another horn answered, then another. He recognized the signal immediately. The prisoners had arrived. The final captives taken during the war had been brought to the capital tonight. War prisoners. Roknar stood still for a long moment. Among the wolves, there was an old tradition after war. Captured enemies were brought before the victorious pack. The Alpha could claim prisoners. Some became servants, some became laborers, some became political hostages, and some became something worse. Roknar had never cared for the ritual, but tonight, something inside him stirred, something cold, something restless, something that wanted to feel anything other than grief. He turned toward the door. The guards outside straightened immediately. "My king?" Roknar's voice was quiet. "Prepare the claiming hall." The guards hesitated. "The prisoners only arrived moments ago." "I know." Roknar stepped into the corridor. "Tomorrow," he said calmly, "I will choose one." Morning came slowly to the capital, but word had already spread. The Alpha King himself would attend the prisoner claiming. The great hall filled quickly. Warriors stood beside the stone pillars. Nobles gathered along the balconies. Servants whispered behind the walls. At the center of the hall, the prisoners knelt in chains. Some trembled, some stared at the floor, some prayed silently. Near the end of the line knelt a young woman who did none of those things. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, her head tilted slightly as if listening to distant sounds. But her eyes did not see the hall. They did not see the warriors. They did not see the throne above them, because they were pale, clouded, blind. Her name was Clara. Few people in the hall knew who she truly was. Fewer knew she carried the blood of enemy royalty. But even in chains, she did not tremble. The great doors suddenly opened. The sound echoed across the chamber. Alpha King Roknar entered. The hall fell silent. Not respectful silence, uneasy silence, because the man walking toward the throne was not the king who'd left for war. Grief had carved something colder into him, something darker. Ragnar sat upon the throne. For a moment, he simply watched the prisoners, one by one. His gaze passed over them. Warriors, servants, broken soldiers. Then his eyes stopped on Clara. She knelt perfectly still, as if she already knew he was looking. Ragnar stood. Slowly he stepped down from the throne. His boots echoed across the hall. He passed the first prisoner, then the second, then the third. The entire chamber watched him now, because something about the king felt different, unstable, unpredictable. Ragnar stopped in front of the blind girl. For a long moment he said nothing. Clara did not bow her head. She did not tremble. She simply waited. Then the Alpha King spoke. His voice was calm, cold, certain. "I claim the blind one." Shock took the entire hall. Whispers spread through the balconies. Even the warriors looked at each other in confusion. Many questions were asked, but the main one was, why her? Of all the prisoners, why choose the one who could not even see him? Ragnar ignored them. He crouched in front of her, close enough now to study her face, the faint scars near her temple, the quiet strength in the way she sat. He leaned closer. His voice dropped to a whisper only she could hear. "You won't see what I become." Clara said nothing, but for the first time, her fingers tightened around the chains, and somewhere deep inside the hall, something ancient began to stir. The claiming hall emptied slowly that day. Chains clattered. Guards shouted orders. Prisoners were dragged away one by one to whatever fate awaited them. But Clara remained where she was, still kneeling, still blind, still listening. The chains around her wrists had been removed, but two guards stood close beside her, watching, waiting, not because she was dangerous, because she now belonged to someone dangerous. The Alpha King. The heavy doors of the chamber finally closed. Silence returned. Then one guard spoke. "The king will decide where to place you." Clara said nothing. She simply tilted her head slightly, listening. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear footsteps. Slow, heavy, measured. They echoed faintly through the stone corridors of the fortress. The guards didn't notice, but Clara did. Night came. The fortress settled into darkness. Torches burned low along the corridors. Most of the castle slept peacefully after weeks of war and celebration, but one part of the fortress remained restless. The king's wing. Alpha King Ragnar walked the corridors again, back and forth, boots striking the stone floor. The guards outside his chambers stood stiffly against the wall, pretending not to notice, but they heard it. Everyone heard it. The pacing, night after night, sometimes until dawn. Ragnar stopped at the end of the corridor. His chest rose slowly. For a moment, he thought exhaustion might finally claim him. He turned back toward his chamber. Maybe tonight. But the moment he closed his eyes, the battlefield returned. Screams, steel, blood, and her voice. "Ragnar!" He jerked awake again, breathing harder now. The nightmare never ended the same way. Sometimes the arrow struck her heart, sometimes her throat. Sometimes she simply disappeared into the smoke of battle, but every dream ended with the same thing. Silence. Ragnar slammed his palm against the stone wall. The sound echoed down the corridor. The guards stiffened again, but no one spoke. No one dared. The king pushed open the doors of his chamber. Inside, the fire in the hearth had burned low. Shadows filled the room, and near the far wall, someone sat quietly. Clara. Her chains were gone now, but she remained seated on the floor beside the wall, exactly where the servants had left her. Still, calm. Ragnar had almost forgotten she was there. For a moment, he simply stared at her. Then he walked past her toward the table. A goblet of wine waited there again, untouched. He poured it anyway, drank. The burn of it did nothing. Ragnar set the goblet down harder than necessary. Behind him, Clara finally spoke. "You haven't slept in days." The words were quiet, soft, but they struck the room like thunder. Ragnar froze. Slowly, very slowly, he turned around. His eyes narrowed. "Who told you that?" Clara didn't answer immediately. She simply faced forward, toward the sound of his breathing, toward the sound of his heartbeat. Then she spoke again. "No one told me." Ragnar stepped closer. The air in the chamber grew colder. "You are blind." "Yes." "Then how would you know that?" Clara tilted her head slightly, listening again, to the rhythm inside his chest, fast, uneven, restless. "You walk the corridors every night." Ragnar said nothing. "You stop outside the same window," she continued quietly, "and sometimes you whisper a name." Silence swallowed the chamber. For the first time since the war ended, someone had spoken about the nights, about the things he thought no one noticed. Ragnar crouched slowly in front of her, close enough now to study her pale eyes again. "You shouldn't speak about things you don't understand." Clara remained calm. "I understand more than you think." Ragnar leaned closer, his voice lowered, dangerous. "You understand nothing." Clara turned her head slightly toward him, toward the sound of his heart. Then she said something that made the Alpha King go completely still. "I can hear it." Ragnar frowned. "Hear what?" Clara's fingers rested lightly on the stone floor beside her. "Your heartbeat." Ragnar scoffed. "You expect me to believe that?" Clara didn't react. She simply spoke. "It beats faster when you remember her." Ragnar's breath caught. For the first time, his control slipped. Clara continued quietly. "I can hear it from across the room." The fire cracked softly in the hearth. Shadows flickered across the walls. And for the first time since claiming her, Alpha King Ragnar realized something unsettling. The blind girl wasn't helpless. She was listening to everything. At the center of the great hall of Iron Fang's citadel stood the girl everyone had come to see, Princess Clara, the blind prisoner. Chains hung from her wrists, but they did not drag her posture down. She stood upright, shoulders calm, chin slightly raised toward the throne she could not see. Yet, strangely, it felt like she could. At the far end of the chamber sat the ruler who had claimed her, Alpha King Ragnar. His massive throne was carved from black stone and wolf bone. One arm rested lazily against the armrest, but his eyes never left the prisoner in the center of the hall. Ragnar had expected many things when he chose her: fear, tears, begging. Instead, she had given him silence, and it unsettled him more than any scream ever could. A court noble leaned forward with a sneer. "Well now, isn't this pitiful?" Soft laughter rippled through the hall. A blind princess, from a defeated pack, claimed like spoils. Another voice spoke. "Tell us, girl, do you even know where you are standing?" Clara did not respond. Her head tilted slightly, listening. The noble continued, voice sharper now. "You stand before the throne of the most feared alpha alive." Still no answer, only quiet breathing. The whispers grew. Perhaps she truly is useless. Maybe Ragnar chose wrong. A third noble rose slowly, older, cruel eyes. He stepped down the stone stairs toward Clara. "Well then, let us test something." He circled her slowly. "You cannot see the throne." A step closer. "You cannot see the warriors." Another step. "So tell me." He leaned near her ear. "How will you survive in a court that devours weakness?" The hall waited. Clara finally spoke. Her voice was calm, too calm. "I survived the battlefield." The noble frowned. Clara continued. "I survived when your soldiers burned our gates." Silence took over the chamber. "And I survived the moment the blade meant for my brother took my sight instead." A ripple of surprise moved through the nobles. Even Ragnar leaned slightly forward. The noble scoffed. "A convenient story." Clara slowly turned her face toward him. "You smell of cedar oil and old scars." The noble froze. "You limp slightly when you turn left." The court shifted uneasily. And your heartbeat, she paused, just changed. The man stepped back. How? Clara faced forward again. I do not need eyes to know the world around me. Now the silence in the hall was different. Respect had slipped quietly into it. From the throne, Ragnar watched with narrowed eyes. Interesting. Very interesting. One of the younger warriors laughed loudly, trying to break the tension. Well, even a blind wolf can growl. More laughter followed. Ragnar finally stood. The entire chamber fell silent immediately. His footsteps echoed as he descended the throne steps. Heavy, measured, predatory. He stopped several paces in front of Clara, close enough to feel her presence, close enough to test her. Tell me something, princess. His voice carried through the hall like distant thunder. You speak of battle. You speak of survival. But now you stand in my court. His golden eyes hardened. Chained, claimed, owned. A murmur ran through the nobles. Ragnar stepped closer. What strength remains now? Clara lifted her head slightly. She faced the direction of his voice. You think chains define strength. Ragnar's brow twitched. Clara continued softly. I lost my sight protecting my people, my warriors, my brother. The hall remained utterly still. But you, her voice lowered, you rule an empire and still look like a man fighting something he cannot defeat. A ripple of shock exploded through the nobles. Someone whispered, She dares? Ragnar's eyes darkened. Careful, princess. Clara did not move. You are not angry at me. The chamber seemed to shrink around those words. She continued, You are angry at death. The silence that followed felt like a blade drawn across the room. Ragnar's jaw tightened. Clara spoke one final sentence. You can smell it coming. For the first time since the war ended, Alpha King Ragnar looked shaken. A low growl vibrated through his chest. He turned away sharply and strode back toward his throne. But before sitting, his hand slammed down on the stone armrest. Crack! The sound exploded through the hall. The thick black stone split beneath his grip. A pulse of raw alpha power burst outward like a shockwave. Torches flickered violently. Several nobles recoiled in fear. But Clara did not move. She simply stood there, calm, listening, watching the king without eyes. And somewhere deep inside the throne room, something had just changed. Something dangerous. Something inevitable. Ragnar slowly sat back in his fractured throne. His gaze locked onto the blind princess. And for the first time since claiming her, the Alpha King realized something unsettling. He had not captured a helpless prisoner. He had brought a storm into his court.
Night made its way back. Most of the court had retreated to their chambers, but one man could not sleep. Alpha King Ragnar stood alone inside the war chamber. The room was wide and circular, lined with old battle maps, iron weapons, and wolf banners stained by years of conquest. Moonlight filtered through the tall windows, painting pale silver across the stone floor. Ragnar had not moved for nearly an hour. His hands rested on the edge of the war table, his head hung low, breathing slow, that his mind was anything but calm. Her words still echoed inside him. You are angry at death. The sentence gnawed at him like claws. He clenched the edge of the table harder. The wood cracked slightly under his grip. A low growl vibrated through his chest. Behind him, the heavy chamber doors opened. 2 guards stepped in, dragging chains between them, and at the end of those chains, Princess Clara walked calmly into the room. Her steps were steady. Even without sight, she navigated the stone floor as if she had walked it many times before. The guards forced her forward. Your prisoner, Alpha King. Ragnar did not turn immediately. For several seconds, only silence filled the chamber. Then slowly, he faced her. Moonlight revealed the tension carved across his face. His golden eyes burned with something deeper than anger. Grief. Rage. Something broken. Leave us. The guards hesitated. Ragnar's voice dropped lower. Now. The chains were released. The doors closed. The chamber fell into heavy silence. Ragnar walked slowly toward her. Each step echoed, controlled, predatory. You speak boldly for a prisoner. Clara stood still. Her chains rested quietly against the floor. You asked questions. Her voice remained calm. I answered them. Ragnar stopped a few feet away. You think you understand me. I understand pain. His jaw tightened. You understand nothing. Suddenly, he grabbed the chain attached to her wrists and yanked her closer. The metal rattled sharply. Clara stumbled one step forward but did not fall. Ragnars's voice hardened. You stand in my fortress, my kingdom, my world. His grip tightened. And you dare analyze the alpha who rules it? Clara lifted her chin slightly. You brought me here. Silence. Then softly she added, so something inside you wanted me to speak. The words struck deeper than any blade. Ragnar's eyes flashed. His control snapped. He slammed the chains against the stone pillar beside them. The impact echoed through the chamber. You think this is a game? His voice thundered. Do you think your calm makes you powerful? Clara did not recoil. Instead, she listened. Her breathing remained slow. You are not trying to hurt me. Ragnar froze. Her voice stayed steady. You are trying to hurt yourself through me. Something inside him snapped. A violent surge of energy exploded from his body. The torches along the wall burst brighter. The war table rattled. Ragnar's wolf roared beneath his skin. His eyes flashed brighter gold. You know nothing about my pain. The air inside the chamber thickened with alpha power. Even the stone walls trembled slightly. But Clara did not scream. She did not fight. Instead, she stepped closer. Just one step. The chains dragged softly across the floor. Ragnar stared at her in disbelief. Do you not fear death? Clara tilted her head. I already faced it. Silence. Then she spoke gently. You lost someone. Ragnar's breathing grew heavier. You carry their absence like a wound. The alpha power around him began to surge again. His wolf pushed harder. Energy crackled through the air like distant lightning. You should stop speaking. But Clara continued. Your wolf is not angry. Her voice softened further. He is grieving. That was the moment everything broke. A shockwave burst from Ragnar's body. Boom! The windows across the chamber shattered instantly. Glass exploded outward into the night. The torches dent violently in the blast of energy. Wind roared through the room. Ragnar staggered back a step. His chest heaved. Raw power radiated from him in visible waves. And then, something strange happened. Clara straightened slowly. Her head turned toward him. Even without sight, she reacted. You, she whispered. Ragnar stared at her. The golden light surrounding his body pulsed brighter. His wolf energy was no longer invisible. It flickered through the air like fire beneath his skin. And somehow, the blind princess sensed it. Her face lifted toward him. Confusion crossed her calm expression for the first time. There is light around you. Ragnar's heart pounded once, hard. Clara whispered again. And it's growing. The wind howled through the broken windows. The Alfating stood frozen in the center of the storm he had created. And before either of them could understand what had just awakened, the power surged again, stronger, wilder, more dangerous than before.
Night returned, but this night was different. Because for the first time since the war ended, the Alpha King was afraid of something he did not understand. The shattered windows of the war chamber had been sealed with thick curtains. Servants had cleared the broken glass hours ago, but the tension from that night still lingered in the air like the echo of thunder. Ragnar stood alone beside the long council table, his arms crossed, his mind restless. Across the room, Clara sat quietly in a wooden chair near the wall. The chains on her wrists were lighter now, though they were still there. She had not spoken since the explosion of power the night before, not once. Ragnar studied her carefully. She sat perfectly still, listening. The strange calm around her unsettled him. Most prisoners either begged or feared him. She did neither. Finally, he broke the silence. You said you could see light. Clara did not move her head. I did not say see. Ragnar frowned slightly. Then what did you mean? Clara's fingers brushed lightly across the chain resting on her lap. I feel things others do not. The Alpha King leaned slightly against the table. Explain. For a moment she seemed to search for the right words. Then she spoke slowly. People carry fractures inside them. Ragnar's expression hardened. Fractures? Yes. Her voice remained quiet but certain. Fear, anger, grief, guilt. She turned her face slightly toward him. Most people hide those fractures well. A small pause followed. But yours, the silence deepened. Yours are loud. Ragnar said nothing. Clara continued quietly. They pulse like cracks through stone. The king's golden eyes narrowed. And what does that have to do with the light you mentioned? Clara inhaled slowly. When your anger rose last night, her fingers tightened slightly on the chain. The fractures inside you widened. Ragnar straightened. And then something else pushed through them. Ragnar felt the memory of that moment surge through his body again. The burst of energy, the roar of his wolf, the shattering windows. He had felt power before. Every alpha did, but that had been different. Wild, unstable, dangerous. Clara continued quietly. Your aura is not stable. The word made Ragnar's jaw tighten. My aura? Yes. She tilted her head again as if listening to something only she could sense. It shifts constantly. Her voice lowered, like a storm trying to tear itself apart. The room grew still. Ragnar stared at her. You speak as if you've studied this. Clara shook her head gently. No. A small pause followed. I simply feel it. Ragnar walked slowly across the room toward her. His boots echoed softly on the stone floor. When he stopped in front of her, he spoke in a low voice. If what you say is true, he leaned slightly closer. Why are you still calm? Clara answered without hesitation. Because it quiets when I am near. Ragnar froze. What? She lifted her chin slightly. Your storm. Another silence fell. Ragnar searched her expression. You're saying you control it. Clara shook her head again. No. Her voice softened. I stabilize it. The word hung in the air between them. Ragnar stepped back slowly. His mind raced. Since the claiming, since the blind girl had been brought into the citadel, his nights had felt different. Still restless, still haunted. But something about the endless storm inside him had slightly eased. He had assumed it was a coincidence. Now he wasn't sure. Clara continued quietly. If your aura continues fracturing like this, her fingers curled slowly around the chain, you will eventually lose control. Ragnar's eyes hardened. My wolf has never controlled me. I didn't say your wolf. Silence. Then she finished softly. I said the storm. The torches flickered slightly. Ragnar turned away and walked toward the chamber doors. For the first time in many nights, he felt exhausted. Not angry, not restless, just tired. He stopped at the doorway. Without turning back, he spoke. You will remain here tonight. Clara nodded once. I understand. Ragnar stepped out into the corridor, but he did not go far. Instead, he moved into the adjoining chamber connected to the war room, a smaller private room used by the Alpha during long council nights. A bed rested against the wall. He had not used it in months. Ragnar sat down slowly. His body felt strangely heavy, his mind quieter than it had been in weeks. Through the stone wall beside him, Clara sat silently in the next chamber, listening, feeling. Minutes passed. Then something unexpected happened. Ragnar leaned back against the bed, his eyes closed. The storm inside him slowed. The battlefield screams faded. The memory of blood softened. His wolf, usually restless in the night, became still. For the first time in 21 nights, Alpha King Ragnar slept. Deeply, peacefully. And in the chamber beside him, Clara tilted her head slightly, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing through the stone wall. A faint, sad smile touched her lips, because she knew something the Alpha King did not yet understand. Her presence was not simply calming him, it was binding their fates together, and neither of them yet knew what that would awaken. Night returned, but this night was different. Because for the first time since the war ended, the Alpha King was afraid of something he did not understand. The shattered windows of the war chamber had been sealed with thick curtains. Servants had cleared the broken glass hours ago, but the tension from that night still lingered in the air like the echo of thunder. Ragnar stood alone beside the long council table, his arms crossed, his mind restless. Across the room, Clara sat quietly in a wooden chair near the wall. The chains on her wrists were lighter now, though they were still there. She had not spoken since the explosion of power the night before, not once. Ragnar studied her carefully. She sat perfectly still, listening. The strange calm around her unsettled him. Most prisoners either begged or feared him. She did neither. Finally, he broke the silence. "You said you could see light." Clara did not move her head. "I did not say see." Ragnar frowned slightly. "Then what did you mean?" Clara's fingers brushed lightly across the chain resting on her lap. "I feel things others do not." The Alpha King leaned slightly against the table. "Explain." For a moment she seemed to search for the right words. Then she spoke slowly. "People carry fractures inside them." Ragnar's expression hardened. "Fractures?" "Yes." Her voice remained quiet but certain. "Fear, anger, grief, guilt." She turned her face slightly toward him. "Most people hide those fractures well." A small pause followed. "But yours?" The silence deepened. "Yours are loud." Ragnar said nothing. Clara continued quietly. "They pulse like cracks through stone." The king's golden eyes narrowed. "And what does that have to do with the light you mentioned?" Clara inhaled slowly. "When your anger rose last night," her fingers tightened slightly on the chain. "The fractures inside you widened." Ragnar straightened. "And then?" "And then something else pushed through them." Ragnar felt the memory of that moment surge through his body again. The burst of energy, the roar of his wolf, the shattering windows. He had felt power before. Every alpha did. But that had been different. Wild, unstable, dangerous. Clara continued quietly. "Your aura is not stable." The word made Ragnar's jaw tighten. "My aura?" "Yes." She tilted her head again, as if listening to something only she could sense. "It shifts constantly." Her voice lowered, like a storm trying to tear itself apart. The room grew still. Ragnar stared at her. "You speak as if you've studied this." Clara shook her head gently. "No." A small pause followed. "I simply feel it." Ragnar walked slowly across the room toward her. His boots echoed softly on the stone floor. When he stopped in front of her, he spoke in a low voice. "If what you say is true," he leaned slightly closer, "why are you still calm?" Clara answered without hesitation. "Because it quiets when I am near." Ragnar froze. "What?" She lifted her chin slightly. "Your storm." Another silence fell. Ragnar searched her expression. "You're saying you control it." Clara shook her head again. "No." Her voice softened. "I stabilize it." The word hung in the air between them. Ragnar stepped back slowly. His mind raced. Since the claiming, since the blind girl had been brought into the citadel, his nights had felt different. Still restless, still haunted. But something about the endless storm inside him had slightly eased. He had assumed it was a coincidence. Now he wasn't sure. Clara continued quietly. "If your aura continues fracturing like this," her fingers curled slowly around the chain, "you will eventually lose control." Ragnar's eyes hardened. "My wolf has never controlled me." "I didn't say your wolf." Silence. Then she finished softly. "I said the storm." The torches flickered slightly. Ragnar turned away and walked toward the chamber doors. For the first time in many nights, he felt exhausted. Not angry, not restless, just tired. He stopped at the doorway. Without turning back, he spoke. "You will remain here tonight." Clara nodded once. "I understand." Ragnar stepped out into the corridor, but he did not go far. Instead, he moved into the adjoining chamber connected to the war room, a smaller private room used by the Alpha during long council nights. A bed rested against the wall. He had not used it in months. Ragnar sat down slowly. His body felt strangely heavy, his mind quieter than it had been in weeks. Through the stone wall beside him, Clara sat silently in the next chamber, listening, feeling. Minutes passed. Then something unexpected happened. Ragnar leaned back against the bed, his eyes closed. The storm inside him slowed. The battlefield screams faded. The memory of blood softened. His wolf, usually restless in the night, became still. For the first time in 21 nights, Alpha King Ragnar slept, deeply, peacefully, and in the chamber beside him, Clara tilted her head slightly, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing through the stone wall. A faint, sad smile touched her lips, because she knew something the Alpha King did not yet understand. Her presence was not simply calming him, it was binding their fates together, and neither of them yet knew what that would awaken. The kingdom had always been a place where power was watched carefully, and power was judged even more carefully. 3 nights had passed since the windows of the war chamber shattered, 3 nights since the Alpha King had slept. Word traveled quietly through the castle. The servants noticed first, then the guards, then the court. Alpha King Ragnar had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. He no longer walked the corridors every night like a restless spirit. The echo of his pacing boots had grown quieter, and that alone made the elders uneasy, because kings did not simply change, not without reason, and in the center of that reason was a blind prisoner. The royal council chamber buzzed with low whispers. Gray-haired elders stood beside tall stone pillars, their voices careful but sharp. Lord Varric, the oldest among them, leaned heavily on his cane. This prisoner should never have remained in the citadel. Another elder nodded. The king claimed her himself. That is the problem. Their voices dropped lower. Since she arrived, he sleeps. And since when does grief vanish so easily? Lord Varric's eyes darkened. Grief does not vanish. He looked toward the heavy doors of the chamber. It transforms. Another elder spoke carefully. You believe she influences him. Varric tapped his cane once against the stone floor. I believe, he said slowly, that the Alpha King is weakening. Silence followed. In a kingdom built on strength, weakness was dangerous, even for a king, especially for a king. Meanwhile, in the lower courtyard garden, Clara walked slowly along a narrow stone path. 2 guards followed behind her. The chains had been removed from her wrists 2 days earlier, not by order of the council, but by order of Ragnar himself. The blind princess moved carefully, her fingers brushing lightly against the rough stone wall beside her. She listened to the wind, to the distant calls of ravens, to the subtle vibrations of footsteps across the courtyard. Every sound painted a picture in her mind. Then, suddenly, a new sound entered the quiet. Footsteps. Soft. Too soft. Not guards. Not servants. Clara stopped walking. The guards behind her noticed. Move, one of them said impatiently, but Clara did not move. Her head tilted slightly. Listening, there were 3 of them, approaching quickly. Then, steel slid from a sheath. The guards turned. Who? The attack came instantly. Dark-cloaked figures rushed from the archway, blades flashing in the afternoon light. One guard fell before he could even draw his sword. The second barely raised his weapon before he was knocked aside. The assassins moved straight toward Clara. She did not scream. She stepped back, listening and calculating, but she could not see the blade descending toward her. And then a roar exploded across the courtyard. Stop! Alpha King Ragnar moved like a storm breaking loose. He had been crossing the upper balcony when he saw the attack below. By the time his boots hit the courtyard floor, the first assassin was already flying across the stone. Ragnar's fist crashed into the man's chest like a hammer. The second attacker lunged toward Clara. Ragnar moved faster. His hand closed around the assassin's throat and slammed him into the wall. The stone cracked under the impact. The final attacker rushed forward with a raised dagger straight toward Clara's back. Ragnar saw it. Clara! But Clara had already moved, not away from the blade, toward Ragnar. The dagger meant for him. She heard it coming, the shift of fabric, the change in breathing, the strike aimed at the Alpha King's blind side. Without hesitation, she stepped between them. The dagger sank into her shoulder. Ragnar froze. For a split second, the entire courtyard stopped moving. Clara gasped softly as the dagger slid free. Blood spread across her pale sleeve. Then Ragnar's rage erupted. His wolf surged forward like a wildfire. The final assassin never even saw the strike. Ragnar's hand hit him with such force that the man crashed across the courtyard stones and did not move again. Silence fell, heavy. Breathing hard, Ragnar turned back towards Clara. She swayed slightly. Blood dripped slowly onto the stone path. Ragnar caught her before she could fall. His voice came out rough. Why? Clara's breathing was shallow but steady. You were the target, she whispered. Ragnar stared at her in disbelief. You stepped in front of the blade. Clara's head tilted faintly toward him. You are the Alpha. Her voice remained calm despite the pain. If you fall, many fall. Ragnar felt something tighten in his chest, something unfamiliar. He had seen warriors die for him before, but this was different. She had not hesitated, not even for a heartbeat, and she could not even see the blade. The courtyard guards rushed in, weapons drawn, but the attack was already over. Ragnar lifted Clara carefully into his arms. Call the healers. His voice was colder than winter. And lock the gates. He turned toward the citadel, carrying her. Inside the towering stone walls, eyes were watching from the upper balconies, watching everything. Watching the Alpha King carry the blind princess in his arms, watching the blood on his hands, and the whisper spread again through the court like wildfire. The king was protecting her, not as a prisoner, not as a servant, but as something far more dangerous. Hours later, the healers worked quietly inside the royal infirmary. The wound was deep, but not fatal. Ragnar stood near the doorway, silent, watching. The chief healer finally stepped back. She will live, my king. Ragnar nodded slowly. Clara lay unconscious on the narrow bed, her breathing calm, peaceful. Ragnar stared at the bandage across her shoulder. Then something strange struck him. The blade had not been meant for her, it had been meant for him. She had taken it instead, and the realization unsettled him more than the attack itself. Because for the first time since the war ended, someone had protected him, not out of loyalty, not out of duty, but out of choice. Ragnar turned toward the dark hallway outside the infirmary. The shadows of the citadel stretched long across the stone floor, and somewhere within those shadows, the court elders were already planning their next move. Because if the blind girl could influence the king this much, then she had become far more dangerous than any enemy on the battlefield. The fortress was quieter than usual. Torches still burned along the stone walls, but a strange stillness had settled over the castle since the assassination attempt. Because the court had witnessed something they did not understand. The Alpha King had carried a prisoner in his arms, not with anger, not with ownership, but with urgency. And that alone made the elders uneasy. Inside the royal infirmary, the air smelled faintly of herbs and burning oils. Clara lay resting on the narrow healer's bed. A thick bandage covered her shoulder. The wound had been cleaned and stitched carefully. The healers had already left. Only one person remained, Alpha King Ragnar. He stood beside the window, staring into the dark courtyard below. For a long time, he said nothing, but he could hear her breathing, slow, steady, alive. Finally, Clara spoke. "You're still here." Ragnar turned slightly. "You're awake." She shifted slowly, wincing faintly as the wound pulled. "You saved me." Ragnar's jaw tightened. "You stepped in front of the blade." Silence followed. Clara tilted her head slightly towards him. "You would have done the same." Ragnar did not answer, because he was not sure if that was true. For weeks he had been living like a man made of stone, cold, detached, untouchable. But lately, something inside him had begun to shift, something quieter, something unfamiliar. He walked slowly toward the bed. Why? Clara's brow creased faintly. Why what? Why protect me? Her answer came simply, because you were about to die. Ragnar stared at her. That didn't answer the question. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, because I know what it is to lose everything. Ragnar felt the words land deeper than expected. His voice lowered. You lost your sight in the war. Clara nodded slowly. Yes. Ragnar studied her face carefully. You were fighting. It was not a question. Clara's fingers brushed lightly across the bandage on her shoulder. I was trained to fight. Ragnar's eyes narrowed slightly. A princess trained for war. Clara gave a faint smile. My father believed rulers should bleed beside their people. Ragnar understood that belief. He had lived by it himself. Then he asked quietly, how did it happen? The room grew still. Clara did not answer immediately. Instead, she slowly lifted her hand. Her fingers brushed lightly against the edge of Ragnar's sleeve. The moment her skin touched him, something strange happened. The air around them shifted. Ragnar's breath caught suddenly. A sharp pulse of energy moved through his chest. His vision blurred, and then the world changed. He was no longer inside the infirmary. The smell of herbs vanished. The stone walls disappeared. Now he stood on a battlefield. Smoke filled the sky. Screams echoed through the air. Steel clashed against steel. Ragnar turned slowly. Warriors fought across a burning field. Then he saw her, Clara, but younger. Her eyes clear, bright. She moved across the battlefield with a sword in her hand, not as a princess hiding behind soldiers, but as a warrior, fast, precise, fearless. She fought beside wounded fighters, defending them as they retreated. Then suddenly, a horn sounded in the distance. Enemy archers moved along a ridge. Ragnar watched the moment unfold helplessly. An arrow flew, straight toward a wounded soldier lying on the ground. Clara saw it. Without hesitation, she stepped forward. She pushed the wounded man aside. The arrow struck her instead. Not her chest, not her heart, but her eyes. The world exploded into darkness. Her scream echoed across the battlefield. Ragnar felt the pain like a knife inside his own chest. The vision shattered. The infirmary returned. Ragnar staggered back a step. His breathing was uneven. Clara lowered her hand slowly. You saw it. Ragnar stared at her in stunned silence. That was your memory. Yes. Ragnar struggled to steady himself. You protected a soldier. Clara nodded faintly. He was barely 16. The room was quiet again. 2 warriors, 2 leaders, both scarred by the same war, both carrying wounds that never truly healed. Ragnar finally spoke. You lost your sight protecting someone else. Clara's voice was calm. You lost your queen protecting your kingdom. The words landed heavily between them. Parallel pain, parallel sacrifice. Ragnar looked at her differently now, not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as someone who had walked through the same fire. Slowly, he sat beside the bed. For the first time since the war ended, the storm inside him did not rage. Clara spoke softly. When I touched you, your pain flowed through me. Ragnar looked at her sharply. What? She pressed her hand lightly against her chest. I can feel it. Her voice grew quieter. The grief, the rage, the emptiness. Ragnar's voice hardened. Then stop. Clara shook her head gently. I can't. A small pause followed. Not if I want to help you heal. Ragnar stared at her in disbelief. You're absorbing it. Yes. Why would you do that? Clara's answer was simple. Because if the storm inside you grows too large, her blind eyes turned towards him, you will destroy yourself. The torches flickered softly. Ragnar felt something shift again inside his chest. Not anger, not grief, something warmer, something fragile, something dangerously close to trust. Then, suddenly, a loud knock struck the infirmary door. Ragnar stood immediately. Enter. The door opened. An elderly royal archivist stepped inside, clutching a rolled parchment. My king, forgive the interruption. Ragnar frowned. What is it? The old man bowed nervously. "I was reviewing ancient alliance records from before the war." He slowly unrolled the scroll. His voice trembled slightly. "There is something you should see." Ragnar stepped closer. The parchment displayed two royal bloodline symbols. One belonged to Ragnar's house, the other, Clara's. The archivist swallowed nervously. "My king, these bloodlines were once united." Ragnar's eyes narrowed. "How?" The old man pointed to the faded ink. 6 generations ago." He hesitated. "Our packs were allies." The room fell silent. Ragnar slowly turned his head towards Clara. She remained perfectly still on the bed, listening, feeling, because something ancient had just been uncovered, and whatever destiny had begun weaving between them had started long before either of them were born. At dawn, a pale gold light stretched across the mountains, spilling over stone towers that had seen generations of war and rule. The banners of the pack moved gently in the morning wind. For the first time in many seasons, the fortress did not feel heavy. Something inside it had changed. Inside the great hall, members of the court gathered in cautious silence. Elders stood along the stone walls, their expressions guarded. Warriors lingered near the pillars. Servants moved quietly, sensing that this morning carried weight. At the far end of the hall, the throne stood beneath the carved crest of the Alpha bloodline. But today, the throne did not belong to one ruler. 2 figures approached it. Alpha King Ragnar walked with steady steps, his broad shoulders no longer carrying the restless tension that had once followed him like a storm. The sharp edge that had ruled his voice and movements for years had softened, not with weakness, but with control. True control. Beside him walked Clara, the princess who had arrived in chains, the woman many had expected to break. She moved with calm confidence, one hand resting lightly against Ragnar's arm. Her eyes, once clouded by darkness, now reflected the faint glow of the hall's torchlight. Her sight had not returned completely, but it had returned enough. Shapes, light, movement. The world had begun to return to her slowly, like dawn spreading across a dark sky. Yet the change in Clara was not in her vision. It was in the way she carried herself. No chains, no fear, only quiet strength. Whispers moved through the court as they passed. The same voices that once questioned her worth now fell silent, because something about Clara had become undeniable, and something about Ragnar had changed as well. He reached the throne platform and paused. For a long moment, he looked out across the court. Many of the elders lowered their eyes. They all remembered the king he had been, unstable, unpredictable, a ruler driven by anger and ghosts. Ragnar slowly turned toward Clara. The faintest smile touched his face, not the cold smile of an alpha asserting power, but the quiet expression of a man who had finally found peace with himself. He sat on the throne. Then, without hesitation, he extended his hand toward the seat beside him. A second seat had been placed there, not below the throne, beside it. Clara stepped forward and sat beside him. The court shifted uneasily at first, but Ragnar's voice carried across the hall before any protest could form. "My queen stands beside me," he said, calmly, not loudly, not aggressively, just firmly. "And our rule begins today." Silence followed. Then one of the council members stepped forward slowly, an old wolf whose voice carried the weight of tradition. He studied Clara carefully, perhaps remembering the day she had been brought into this hall in chains. He bowed his head slightly. "Queen Clara," he said respectfully. The words moved through the court like a quiet wave. Queen, not prisoner, not outsider. Queen. Time passed gently after that. The fortress settled into a new rhythm. Ragnar ruled with strength, but the rage that once clouded his judgment no longer controlled him. The storms that had once lived inside him had grown quiet. Clara remained close to him often, not as someone protected, but as someone who understood the fractures inside others. The court had begun to notice something unusual. The king slept peacefully now, more peaceful by the day. And when decisions weighed heavily on the throne, Clara often sensed the tension before anyone spoke it. Where Ragnar brought power, Clara brought balance. One evening, as the sun began to set over the mountains, Clara stood on the high balcony overlooking the valley. The wind moved gently through her dark hair. Below, the packlands stretched far into the fading light. Ragnar stood beside her. She could see his outline clearly now. His height, his shape, not every detail yet, but enough. Enough to know him. Footsteps approached behind them. One of the younger wolves from the court stopped a few steps away, hesitant. He had watched Clara carefully for weeks. Finally, curiosity overcame him. "My queen," he said respectfully. Clara turned slightly toward his voice. "Yes?" The young wolf hesitated before asking his question. "When you first came here, when you faced a king, when you stood in chains," his voice softened, "were you ever afraid?" The question hung gently in the air. The mountains were quiet. The wind carried the last light of day across the valley. Clara thought about the battles she had fought, the war that had taken her sight, the night she had been brought before an unstable alpha king, the moment she had chosen to stand rather than break. Then she smiled softly. "Yes," she said. Her voice held no shame. "No warrior lives without fear." She lifted her face slightly toward the fading light. But fear and brokenness are not the same thing. The young wolf listened carefully. Clara's voice remained calm and certain. "I was afraid." A small pause followed. Then she finished quietly. "But I was never broken." Ragnar looked at her then, not as a king looking at her queen, but as a man looking at the person who had helped him become whole again. Below them, the lands of their united packs stretched peacefully into the distance. And above them, the sky slowly faded into night. A new chapter had begun. Not one ruled by fear, but strength that survived it.
So, what do you think? Did Alpha King Ragnar and the prisoner Princess Clara marry and live happily together? Or did the war return? Would you like to see the continuation in Book 2? Let me know in the comment.
Thanks for staying till this moment. Please like and subscribe to the channel. It means a lot to us.